that I came to these beliefs through the scientific inconsistencies and the fact that it was easier for me to believe in creationism from like an intellectual integrity standpoint, where I feel like I'm doing less mental gymnastics, where I have to do less twisting of the facts to just believe in creation than to believe in evolution. And that's probably my point number 5, that it takes less faith and less almost lying to yourself to believe in creation than it does to believe in evolution.
Hi, Mike.
Hi.
Today I have you on my interview, and you know really much about biology and evolution and things like that. So I just want to ask you to introduce yourself and say something about you, what you've
Okay.
studied and what you know.
Okay. Well, hi, I'm Mike. I'm from the United States, the Southeast. I moved around a little bit. And part of the reason I moved around is because I went to university twice, actually. So I was always interested in science in general, but especially I liked biology. My dad's a doctor, and I don't know, I always talked about finding a cure for diabetes, for example, because my grandma had diabetes. But I was always really interested in the sciences, especially biology. So I studied biology. And after that, I went to medical university in the United States in Tennessee. And if I ever refer to it as medical school, that's exactly the same thing. Sometimes Europeans get confused, but no, medical school is medical university. It's the same thing. But yeah, the reason that we're having this interview, I guess, is because I was telling you about how I used to believe in evolution and all kinds of stuff like that, but I stopped actually from a scientific perspective, where one of the common arguments I think that we get against people who speak out against any mainstream science, mostly evolution, but really some of the others as well, is that they're arguing from a position of their faith first, and if there's some sort of disagreement with the faith and the facts, they'll go with the faith because that's what it's all about. But in my case, well, I always did believe in God, but I it just sort of seemed obvious to me that he at least exists. But I wasn't sure about the details. Like, well, is the Bible, how much of it is figurative, how much of it is literal, and this and that. And my sort of journey is kind of the opposite of what most people would expect, where I started from a belief system that, God exists, but probably most of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, definitely Genesis, is basically just all fables, all, story time, figurative, not real. Um, and then the more I learned about science, the less confident I became in that idea that, evolution occurred over billions of years. That seemed less and less likely to me the more I understood about biochemistry and, mostly physiology and biochemistry. Um, and so, I struggled with it for a while because I would say probably the first seeds of doubt that appeared would have been sometime in my undergraduate university. Don't know exactly when that would have been. Um, Probably comparative vertebrate anatomy, though. That was one of the upper level courses I took where, they make there's a lot of conjecture involved in the mainstream evolutionary theory. And I just didn't like that there's so much guessing involved, just so much. And especially you look at like paleontology, almost every skeleton, even the ones they call complete, are like literal bone chips. They are not impressive specimens, at least to
Could you
someone.
explain it more? Like,
Well,
you know?
yeah. So one of the things that people often will do when you talk about evolution is hold up some shining example of some sort of intermediate form of some animal. Like many of the common creationists, especially arguments against evolution, are against the ape to man idea. And then a few other examples of things that would be very, very difficult to explain from a mainstream evolutionary theory perspective, like whales, for example, are a very common one, or bats. Basically, because whales and bats are both mammals, and mammals are more advanced than fish and reptiles. Fish and reptiles in the water, that's no big deal. But a mammal being in the water makes no sense because they would have had to leave the water and go back in. Um, and so, that's one of the things that creationists will argue. And they've produced a, what was it called? It's etymologically, it means the walking whale. I think it's Ambulocetus, where it's just some old fish thingy that it was a mammal and it swam. It probably lived in the ocean. It's extinct. But even the most complete versions of that, I don't know the exact percentage of it, but if you looked at the actual bones they have on display, it's hard to call that a skeleton. Like it's most of a skull and maybe half the rest of the bones. But I was just never impressed by that. I was like, you're making all these claims about the animals, its behavior and its adaptations based on, looks like you got about 15% of the skeleton there, where I'm sure hopefully it was more than that, but seriously, you should look at some of these images that they have of them. And that's just one example with that one. The most, at least when I was in university, the best example for the ape to man transition that people talked about was Lucy, who's an Australopithecus africanus, I think. I don't remember very well. But Lucy is, you've got about two full bones. You've got most of a humerus and most of a femur, which is the thigh bone. The rest of it, you've got, some partial ribs, some little fragments of your wrist and finger bones, about a quarter, maybe a third of a hip. But that's it. It's, I would say less than half. Oh, and a jaw, I think. There's not much going on up here. Or the Java man, which is the sort of prime Homo erectus specimen. It's like 4 bones, including a couple of teeth. Like part of the skull, it's either a leg or an arm, I think, and then 2 teeth. And they make all of these conjectures based on very incomplete fossil evidence. And so that was probably where the seeds of doubt started forming. But it wasn't something I was willing I was not willing to challenge that belief. And I refer to it as a belief intentionally, because over time I've come to see that evolution and just in general, the mainstream scientific explanation of the world in an atheistic, or they say agnostic, but I don't really think that's it, manner, it's really a belief system, where in many cases, when you look at reality, the empirical, physical, observable reality, the explanation from the atheistic side kind of makes sense. The explanation from the biblical creation side also makes sense. And you basically have to choose, where they are internally consistent for the most part, meaning if you believe in this system, most of it makes sense together. Or if you believe in this system, most of it makes sense together. And I just found that there were more problems with the atheistic, materialistic set of beliefs than with the Bible says what it means beliefs. Just it seems more likely to me.
Let me summarize if I understood it correctly. So you eventually said that it's really hard to say like it was really like that, like evolution in the way that we don't have so much bones like we are supposed to have. It's like just few bones, like 15%. You said, just some part of the being, and it's really hard to say if the being really look like what we think because we have just a few bones. And also I want to ask you, like, for example, what we say about this Australopithecus, like people say like there is so many of these skeletons, like it's so obvious that this is our ancestor. Like, is there really so many of these humerus and all those bones, of each piece, or how many of those actually are,
A lot of the most commonly cited examples of your early hominids, hominid just meaning looking like a person, most of them are very incomplete. And these are the best examples they refer to. So, you might have like 2/3 of a skull. And when I say 2/3 of a skull, I mean they found a bunch of bone chips and they spent a long time putting them back together like a puzzle. And they don't even have the whole thing. But just in general, even if they do have complete skeletons of them, it doesn't really prove anything. And that's something that's very important to understand, that, I do believe that Australopithecus species did exist. They were just an ape that died out and they're not around anymore. I do not believe that they are our ancestor. It's, similar to a dinosaur. They were around for a while, they died, they're gone.
Oh.
And so, because there are all kinds of extinct species. Even in the last century or two, we've had several that have disappeared. And that's really what I see. Whereas, like I was saying a minute ago, where there's two alternative explanations for pretty much all of the data. And with these Australopithecines, that's pretty much what I think, an old extinct ape. And that's even if, some of these specimens aren't frauds. Like one of the most famous, I don't remember what they claimed it was exactly. Like it was one of the missing links. So it might have been a Homo erectus or an Australopithecus. I can't remember what they said it was, but it was from, I think, 1912 to 1953, considered an example of an intermediate species between ape and man called the Piltdown man. You can look it up, Piltdown man. Super famous, lasted 40 years. In 1953, they found out it was a human skull with, I think, an orangutan jaw and maybe some chimpanzee teeth or something like that. It was fake. Like, this was not an accident. It was a forgery where they intentionally made a man out of human and two ape bones. And it's kind of convincing if you look at a picture of it. You're like, well, that is probably about what I guess it would look like. But it's made out of part human, which is 100% human, and part ape, which is 100% ape.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
And so it leads me to the next question. So then you say like, okay, there was this species of Australopithecus, but like then you don't really believe that it was like evolution, like it could became human like we are today. So you don't see like it's possible from this creature, let's call it, because it's hard for me to say it always, to become human. Like how does the biological improvement works between species and kinds, maybe.
Well, it's just not very convincing, because when you want to talk about Australopithecus, one of the reasons I think it's held up as a perfect example of missing link, and evolutionists don't like that term, missing link. But for just a second, Darwin was, presenting his ideas at a time where genetics were very poorly understood. The amount of paleontology that we have available today is way more than we had then. And he was expecting that we would find a gradual change from one animal to the next in the fossil record. We haven't seen that. What we see typically is groups of similar creatures, where, the Australopithecines, there's something like half a dozen species that are mentioned. And it's not even clear to me whether there are, 6 species or 7 or 8. It's somewhere in that region. Because, you have internal variation between the same species. Like I often like to wonder what a paleontologist would do if he'd never seen a dog before and you showed him a bunch of dog bones, like a Great Dane versus a Chihuahua. He would say they're completely different species, probably, because they're very different morphologically. Like the shape of them is very different. And I think that's probably a common argument that creationists will give, but I also think it's a valid one. That there's a lot of guesswork that goes into it. But one of the things that I was going to mention about Australopithecus is that's a genus. There are several species named for it. But these apes, they all have small brains, like less than half the size of ours. And that's one of the biggest issues we have, is the intelligence, where, intelligence is not strictly linked to brain size, but it's definitely related. I mean, strictly linked, I said that incorrectly. More that intelligence is not only dependent on the size of the brain, but it definitely has an influence. Where, there's some animals with fairly small brains that are more intelligent than bigger animals with bigger brains. So it's not the only factor, but it clearly is a factor. Where if you look at just the capacity inside the skull of an Australopithecus, it was less than half of what we have. And considering that's one of the biggest issues in the specifically human evolution thing, I'm just not convinced, where it's just like, well, this and this and that, and then big question mark, human.
So it's not like, wow, this one, like in this species of the ape, it was bigger brain, bigger brain, bigger brain. Oh, here
you
it
get
is human.
some of that. But to give an example, Homo erectus is one of the ones with the biggest brains. Not nearly as big as ours, but more than half as big. Maybe probably 70%. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's getting much closer. But I just told you that the Java man, for example, was the prime example, like the best model of the Homo erectus. And all they had was the top of his skull, just the top, just right here. That's not enough for me. I need to see more. And they don't, as far as I know, they don't have that. They didn't have it, 15 years ago when I was in university.
Oh.
So, yeah.
So it was like just education, like how big it was, the brain, and because of just one part of the brain they found, they made it all up, like this was us.
It's just impressive. Like I especially like the reconstructions where they're kind of color coded, where in a museum exhibit, they often don't use the real bones. They use casts of the bones, but they will typically put the cast of the bones they found in maybe like a dark brown. And then the stuff that they have made obviously fake, they put in white because they just want to show you. And I don't mean fake in a bad way. I just mean, we don't have it. So this is what it would look like. And if you look at Lucy, for example, she's more than half white, less than half brown, because they had to, because they didn't have the bones for it, put, all of this reconstruction in there. And that's typical with paleontology. There are some complete examples of certain animals, but that's kind of the reason for the a natural history museum is if you actually find a full example of some extinct animal like a dinosaur or something, that's a big deal. And, it's worth going to see in a museum because it's not common. I'm not an expert in paleontology by any stretch. But some of the shining examples I've seen for evolution have been less than impressive to me.
And I just wonder, because I really don't know, because you call all this time this Australopithecus Lucy. So you say about one, skeleton, or it's like Lucy is just more of them, or just one, and it's called Lucy's because it's so special, or
it's the one they talked about the most in my personal anatomy class, comparative vertebrate anatomy class, because they'll often give names to the best examples of a species or a transitional form that they find, just to make it easier to refer to. And because, every time they have a discovery like this, it's a big deal in paleontology, so they might as well give it a name. Like you find a new star, you give the star a name, something like that. And yes, Lucy was found, I think, in East Africa. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but it's a skeleton of a small humanoid ape-like woman where most of the bones are missing in that individual skeleton. So that's Lucy. It's one individual skeleton.
And do you know how many of these Australopithecus skeletons were found, or?
I don't know. It's quite a few. But considering that Lucy is one of the best examples and she is less than half there, most of them are fragments. They're not complete.
And so there is just this question, because I just came into this question so many times, like if we can find a proof for some change of the kind, like not like the dog improved to be better dog, but like really change of kind, what I mean.
Yes. So, creationists, and I count myself as a creationist now, but that's a recent phenomenon in my life. Well, not too recent anymore. It's been about 10 years. But we use this term kinds because there's a difference you've got to understand between macro and microevolution, where microevolution is not something I dispute at all. That definitely happens. That's the example of wolf to Great Dane, wolf to Chihuahua. We've documented evidence of that. It's clearly happened. Where even today we're making new breeds of especially domestic animals. Like, cats, they're coming out with a new one. Like there's this one little dwarf cat that it's called a Bambino. It's really cute, but it's new. And people have developed it within the last, I don't know exactly, a couple of decades, I think. But the idea of macroevolution of one kind changing to another, we don't have convincing evidence of that for me. For example, this, I probably should have looked it up, the name of this creature. I'm pretty sure it's Ambulocetus. It's, like I said, it's not even close to enough for me because it could very well be like what I believe Australopithecus is, where it's something kind of similar to a fish or a whale. It's a mammal that has died out, where, you know, we have examples of a creature that is similar to what we would hypothetically expect for a mammal that decided to go back into the water. But is that what it actually is? No proof of it. There's just no proof of it. You have to take it on faith. And that's what I was saying before, that evolution really is a religion, where a lot of these things, you have to take it on faith. And they have faith in the lack of existence of God, basically, versus a faith in the creator who created things as he said he did. And that's sort of my issue with all that.
So yeah, that's why it's called like evolution, because people say like evolution is just theory, like it's not like science, because science, you can prove it. And so you would say like you cannot really prove evolution, like if you would want to.
Not unless we could actually experimentally produce a change of kind from natural processes like selective breeding, where again, people bring up examples of evolution all the time. Like a very common one is corn. But that's not a changing kind. You go from a corn with a tiny little corn fruit. I don't even know, but my botany is terrible. But they produced this, enormous corn ear that we have today, and it took them like, I don't know, a couple hundred years, maybe 1,000. And that is an example of microevolution. But as far as macro, we've never seen it. The closest we've seen is extinct animals that kind of halfway fit in between two animals that we think it might be related to, but you have to take it on faith whether those things were related. And there's not even consensus among the evolutionists how things happen. Because I mentioned that Darwin expected gradualism, as it's called, where you have, animals that are every generation, they're slightly more like what they ended up being. And I think that's probably the most likely, logical way that things might have happened, where, naturally you would expect to see a slow and steady change over time. But the problem is the fossil record does not show that at all, where you get examples like this mammal fish thing, that people are saying is the precursor of the whale, but all of them look the same, where they're all the same. Or Australopithecus, where they all look very close to each other, the same. Where one of them might have a slightly angled hip bone and they think it might have walked upright instead of on all fours. And that's a huge deal, because that's another one of the issues between apes and men, is men walk on 2 legs and apes on 4. Yeah, the problem is we haven't any evidence of a change in kind. And I personally don't think it's possible. I can't say outright that it's impossible, but there's been plenty of opportunity to prove it, and it hasn't been. Where all experimental laboratory evidence of evolution, all of it is microevolution, all of it. And like when you learned about evolution in school, what were some of the examples they gave you?
I just remember the picture, like you said, like Darwin's theory, like from just a person, and then just, like it was like, yeah, something half human, half monkey, and it was just more straight, and then human was led as us.
Yeah, and you get tons of like artist conceptions, drawings, computer renderings, and things like that, because the actual fossil record does not have it. Where again, Darwin expected gradualism. We didn't find it after 100 years, and people started coming up with this other idea called punctuated equilibrium. And they actually were teaching that in my college courses, that this is probably what happened, where they weren't saying they were sure, but they were like, well, it's probably punctuated equilibrium. And that they had to come up with this idea essentially to explain the lack of transitional forms in the fossil record, where it's not this slow increase. What you get is sort of a jumps from one to the next, where these are similar organisms, similar creatures, but there's no evidence that they were necessarily descendant from each other. They could have been parallel. And in many cases, you'll find bones of both of the things in the same place, where they're trying to say that they were separated by, millions of years or whatever, but you find the bones of this one right next to the bones of this one. That doesn't make any sense. But this idea of punctuated equilibrium, grossly oversimplified, is basically you have a lizard and one day it lays an egg and out of the egg comes a chicken, where they're saying that the jumps were bigger. Not quite that big. I'm just trying to say that for illustrations purposes. But basically, they're trying to figure out how to make the fossil record make sense, where you have this one reptile that maybe looks a little bit like a bird, and this next reptile that maybe looks a little bit more like a bird. And they're suggesting that this one came before that one, and then suddenly, one day, this one stopped existing, and this one started being the lizard, bird-like lizard that was around. And there are just too many problems with that, where, especially with animals, most animals produce sexually. So your first chicken-like lizard, who's it going to mate with? It doesn't make any sense, this punctuated equilibrium, because it's the only one that exists. Mutation, going back to my studies, one of the main things that made me stop believing in evolution was that the biochemistry of it just doesn't really make sense, and the physiological effects of it, because mutation generally is bad. In fact, I would go so far as to say that I don't know of a single example of a beneficial mutation in humans, at least. Not a single one. Sickle cell anemia is often used as an example. That was what was used for me in high school, where it's a disease. First of all, it's a disease. It causes problems. And it's from Africa. And if you have sickle cell anemia, you are less likely to get malaria. That's true. But you're also not fitter than if you don't have it. Yes, it might prevent you from dying from malaria, but the whole idea of Darwinism and, goodness, what is the word I'm missing? The survival of the fittest. It's not a fitness advantage to have sickle cell anemia. In fact, you have to be heterozygous for it, where you have one good version of hemoglobin and one bad. Because if you are homozygous for it, you are extremely sick. It's not fatal, not at least right away, but you're extremely sick with it. In fact, that was one of the sort of seeds of doubt for me, that when I got to medical school and I realized that, wait a second, sickle cell anemia is not harmless. That's what they suggested in high school. They suggested it was a positive mutation. It's not. It's unfortunate to even have one copy of the gene. And if you have two, it's very unpleasant. And that's the other thing when it comes to mutations. They just cause disease is what they do in humans. There are definitely there's some differences in genetic trends in populations, where an obvious one would be hair, eye, skin color in the races, because you can see it with your eyes. But when it comes to individual mutations, at least the ones we've identified, so many of them are harmful that it's just hard to get behind this idea of everything in the world having been formed by mutation over time, because that's what natural selection teaches. Because natural selection describes the evolutionary pressure on the phenotype of an organism, meaning what is produced from the genes, but that doesn't describe the changes in the genotype. The genes can only change by mutation, according to Darwinistic view of things. And if that's the case, then we have to look at mutations as an example, and they're not a very encouraging example. You could maybe argue that you could get some sort of changes in genetic material over time through chromosomal differences, because humans have 46 chromosomes, and the problem with that is if you have a difference in chromosomes, it's almost always fatal, where it kills you in utero. It kills the baby that's developing before it's born. People have probably heard of trisomy 21, Down syndrome. That's one of the only ones that won't kill you right away. There's also a 13 and an 18. They're Edwards and Patel, I think in that order, but I'm not sure because they're both so rare, where the median survival for one of them, I think it's Edwards, is about a week. If you make it to be born, your median survival is about a week. And the other one, you might make it a year. There are cases where people with these syndromes last, they survive into young adulthood, maybe. That's very rare. I'm not sure if that might be too far, maybe teenage years, but that's with heavy medical intervention. And in an evolutionary context, it's meaningless.
Like
There's
it's
no,
like fairy tale, like the mutation would be always good and nobody would die. Oh.
Yeah. And the other thing about that is, especially in the context of punctuated equilibrium, one of the things that could possibly make that happen would be a chromosome, either translocation or aneuploidy type situation where you have a change in the number or the structure of a chromosome. That would logically be one of the most likely ways to get a sudden change in an organism's development in an evolutionary context. But it just doesn't work, where you can sometimes get it, but again, trisomy, so trisomy means 3 copies of a chromosome. Trisomy 21, 13, and 18 are not instantly fatal. And then the sex chromosomes, the X and Y, you can have a little bit of wiggle room, I guess you can say, where XXY, XYY, and X by itself, XO it's called, those are all compatible with life, is how we say it. It doesn't kill you right away. But that's a total of 6. 6 changes in chromosomes in the human are possible to have, and it won't kill you instantly. That's not very encouraging. And then you look at animals, for example, and you can have some hybrid creatures out there. It works pretty well with plants and insects as well. But with animals, like higher order animals, I guess insects are technically classified as animals, but the higher ones, you don't usually see it, where, you can have, say, a liger, a mix of a lion and a tiger. The most classical one's probably a mule, a mixture of a horse and a donkey. But in that case, I don't remember the exact numbers. It's something like 62 and 64, where maybe the donkey has 62 and the horse has 64 chromosomes and the mule has 63. Well, if you know anything about how sexual reproduction works, you can't have an odd number. That doesn't make sense. Well, in animals. And so for that reason, mules are almost exclusively sterile. They can't have, they cannot produce offspring. There are a couple historical examples of maybe, 5 mules throughout history who could produce offspring, but it wouldn't surprise me if they themselves had some kind of chromosomal abnormality, and that is what allowed them to do it. So especially in the context of this punctuated equilibrium, where, say donkey to horse is an event that could possibly be explained by a punctuated equilibrium, but really only if you went from 64 to 62. But I'll get to that in a second. But then you've got this issue of sterility, where these hybrids typically have, not very good fertility, or they're just sterile outright. But regarding the other thing that I mentioned, we haven't seen much evidence of gaining of genetic material. In fact, I would say none, with the exception of some hybrids of plants that have more chromosomes than one of their parent species did. And I specifically mean plants, because as far as I know, it doesn't work with other creatures, maybe insects, like the simpler ones, even though simple is not a great word to use for anything biological. Nothing is simple in biology. Even the most simple things are incredibly complex. But you generally can only lose genetic information. You cannot gain it. And that's a big problem, because there's a different sizes of genomes from one animal to the next, or one creature to the next. They have different sizes of genomes. And of course, chromosomes can be different sizes. So some animal that has 60 chromosomes might actually have a smaller genome than an animal that has 58 chromosomes, or even maybe bigger differences in numbers than that. So you can't just go on the number of chromosomes, because they can be different sizes. But there's some that have 100 or even over 100. I think there's a butterfly that has over 100 chromosomes. And there's just, how did that happen? And it's just really hard to explain how you can have such a big difference in the amount of genetic material when there's no viable mechanism for gaining genetic material and not immediately dying, basically. And there are just so many problems with mutation and the way it works, where the genetic code is written in a language of codons, where each codon is 3 letters. There are 4 possibilities for the letters. And so it reads little three-letter words at a time, like cat, dog, pig, 3-letter words, boom, boom, boom. And if you lose one letter, all of a sudden it reads, instead of CAT, you lose the A, and the next word is dog, it'll read CTD. Doesn't make any sense. Where cat without the A, and then the D from dog. And then the next word will be OGP, the OG from dog, and the P from pig. Yeah. And so the entire sentence is complete nonsense just from losing one nucleotide. It's called a frame shift mutation. So either an addition or a deletion of anything that's not a multiple of 3, because the 3-letter codons will cause a frame shift mutation, and the entire protein is going to be complete nonsense after that, the protein being coded for. And so there are just so many issues with it.
So I see like this topic is not really that, easy for people to claim like, okay, evolution is, facts, and you are stupid when you believe in God created as humans from nothing, just, because he created, like I see like, it's like really complicated. If somebody would really want to prove evolution, like it's not like this is facts and you are blindly believing God. Like it's really like faith. You need to decide if you have faith in evolution or you have faith in God, how he created it. And so it leads me to question like, how do you see like the creation of the world? Because people say that, I see so many people writing to me, say, I see like evolution and Bible is, like connected, like, it doesn't contradict itself, like there was this big bang and everything. So how do you see the Genesis and creation?
Well, that again for me has been actually an evolution of my belief over time. It has changed slowly, stepwise, bit by bit, just like we would expect from evolution, and we don't see. Where again, I used to believe in, I guess you could say, guided evolution, where I never doubted God existed, but I just assumed that all the science books had to be correct. And so evolution is obviously true because you're not allowed to not believe it. Where, I had one incident where someone I thought was smart, one of my classmates in medical school, just said offhand that she didn't believe in evolution. And that sort of flipped a switch in my head. I was like, wait, you're smart. What? You're allowed to not believe in evolution? You're smart. I don't understand. And that was a pretty significant event for me. But over time, I've come to believe that Genesis is literally true. I'm talking creation of the world, 7 days, and most importantly, the flood. Because one of the main issues with reconciling these two paradigms is the naturalistic paradigm assumes that nothing has changed, that everything's always been the same, and the conditions have been the same, and I guess nothing has changed. The animals and plants have changed over time through evolution, but that there were no surprises, basically. But if you believe the Bible, there's at least one very big surprise: a worldwide flood that killed almost all of the creatures on the earth, but also would have mixed things up. It would have knocked over trees. It would have drowned a bunch of animals. And those drowned animals would have been moved and then fossilized, where one of the sort of threshold kind of breakthrough moments for my belief in the literal truth of Genesis was when I realized that geology and fossils and all of it could be explained by a flood, in fact, better than they could through millions and millions of years of evolution and stuff. Because, if you get a big bottle and you put some rocks in it, some smaller rocks, some sand, some mud, dirt, clay, and then maybe some leaves, and then you shake the bottle up really well, and then you set it down, it's going to settle in a certain predictable way. And that's essentially what you would expect on the surface of the earth if there were a great flood. And there's evidence for a great flood everywhere. And it's not just biologically with the fossils. There are plenty of places where the rock formations really, really look like water erosion. Problem is they're in the middle of a desert, because water erosion and wind erosion typically don't look the same. One of the coolest places I've ever been is Arches National Park in Utah. And those arches look like they were eroded from water, and it's in the middle of a desert. So that's the other thing about this, which can be very difficult for people who've come from the background where I've come from, where you assume the science books are correct because, after all, you're a smart person. You have to. Only stupid people disagree with the science books, and you have to basically make a big leap where it's much easier to swallow whole all of it. Where, okay, well, some of the problems with believing in creation are solved by believing in the flood, because again, it's a parallel explanation, and you kind of have to choose which one you believe, but it's internally consistent. And it's in fact more internally consistent to believe in creationism and the literal events of Genesis than it is to believe in evolution, especially an unguided, random chance evolution. Because I haven't even said any of the biochemical problems with evolution, maybe one or two, but there are tons and tons of issues where, again, Darwin did not understand genetics and definitely not biochemistry, where even the synthesis of the simplest protein, it's very difficult to imagine how that could be done, not even just without guidance from an intelligent, influence from God, but just the way that everything in the body is formed. And I mean, every single form of life has either DNA or RNA that goes into protein, that it makes into protein. And just to use humans as an example, or any really higher order eukaryote, as they're called, with a nucleus, there's a little bit of variation here, but for the most part, the details are the only things that change slightly. And you have a DNA typically as your source of information, and then you have a whole system of, like, they're basically robots, little tiny molecular robots that turn the DNA into RNA first, and then they move the RNA somewhere else, and then that RNA is read and turned into proteins. But the problem is these robots are themselves made out of protein. Or in the case of the thing that actually, it's called translates the RNA into protein, it's made of a mixture of RNA and protein, which in my opinion is even worse. Like, you have a mixture of RNA and protein, because a lot of the people who argue for abiogenesis, which we haven't talked about much here, but again, I did say that I think abiogenesis is much easier to disprove than evolution. It's just incredibly unlikely for 1,000 reasons. But they will argue that, well, RNA can work as an enzyme, meaning it influences chemical processes or speeds them up typically. And they will say, well, you could theoretically get an RNA molecule that is able to rebuild itself. And at least in the overall general theory of things, that is plausible, because RNA stores information, but it also can act. So it's like a brain and an arm. It can do both of these things, but scientists haven't been able to do it. I was watching some presentations by a guy I found recently who I find very, very good on this subject. And as far as he knew, and he's, a professor or something, I don't know, the most they were able to make is something like 10 or 20 base pairs. And, our genome is much, much longer than that. Much, much longer. Millions. So there are just so many issues with it. I've even forgotten the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I really like how you connected it. Yeah. So, so you believe, like, literally Bible, like 7 days. So because people, argue like how is possible like 7 days, but this is like, we believe in God. So for him is everything possible. So, but this is like really most common question I got, because I ask people if they have some special question for this interview, and most of the questions were actually about people. If we believe the Bible like literally, like, does it mean that there were dinosaurs, and if there were so dinosaurs in the Bible, or if they could live with the humans, because I made a video about that. So maybe if you have some knowledge in this area, so you can share what you think.
Well, knowledge is a strong word for what I'm about to say, I'm afraid. No, this is a topic I typically will shy away from because I have my belief system, but it sounds a little crazier, honestly, than everything I've said up to this point. Well, basically, regarding dinosaurs, I believe that the bones that we have are real and that the creatures existed. They were large reptiles. Most of them lived before the flood, which means they lived with people, yes. Because, man was created on the sixth day. And so he was there for, the flood was, I believe, in the year 1656. So almost 2 millennia, man lived with these creatures. But I'm not sure they were all there before. Look at dogs, for example. You've got a wolf, and then, 1,000 years later, you've got a Chihuahua and what are those really big ones? Mastiff, just enormous creature and a little tiny one. What if people did that with lizards? You could get a lot of different lizards from people who were influencing them, genetic influence. And I'm not talking about necessarily scientific, although I don't know, maybe they did. We don't know much about the pre-flood world. Science would say it doesn't exist. If they influence the animals, they could, in any way, they could change their shape. They could change their form. But it's also possible that, they were created before the flood. And for one reason or another, they just did not find themselves on the ark, didn't make it, didn't survive, for the most part. Because the other thing is, I believe that at least in some cases, I'll preface this by reptiles can live a very long time, very long. Tortoises are the most famous for this. Giant turtles basically can live hundreds and hundreds of years, and we have documented evidence of this. And that's because of this biological concept of senescence, which means aging. Reptiles typically don't senesce in the way that other organisms do. They don't get old. Usually what happens is they just get eaten or something. They get injured. But I believe that some of the dinosaurs actually did survive the flood. Perhaps some of the aquatic ones, and that they just became dragons. There's no difference in my mind between a dragon and a dinosaur. They're both large lizards that people were afraid of. And I'm not saying there were tons and tons of them, but again, lizards can live for a very long time. And we've got some historical evidence of it where basically every culture talks about dragons and draws pictures of them and stuff. And you even have some in fairly recent times. Marco Polo, for example, I believe was in China, and he just matter-of-factly mentioned that they had 2 dragons living in caves. It's like, yeah, there were 2 dragons there. And it wasn't a big deal. He just like, yeah, there are a couple dragons there. They were probably just very large lizards or extant dinosaurs. And, I don't want to go too far into some of these cryptids out there, but there's no reason not to believe that there could be some things in the ocean we don't know about, for example. And in the 70s, a Japanese fishing boat found a recently dead body. And I say recently dead as in, I don't know, within a year, within a couple of months, of a plesiosaur, basically. It was pretty much an aquatic dinosaur, and they found it sometime in the 70s. There's a photo of it on the internet you can find, but they didn't take it in with them because it's an enormous creature and it was dead and probably smelled terrible. They threw it back in the water. But yeah, that's what I believe about dinosaurs, that they definitely existed before the flood, to a much lesser extent after the flood, but probably more in the water than anywhere else. And that any non-mythical, non-made-up stories about dragons, or the kernel of truth that's in most legends, is probably just from a large lizard that you could call a dinosaur or a dragon, depending on, your angle. Because, it's just linguistics, the difference between a dragon and a dinosaur. Dragon, large lizard that's mystical and not real. Dinosaur, large lizard that's historical and real. There's no difference. They're the same thing.
Yeah. And now I have like two questions because of this in my mind. Because people usually have hard times to argue, to imagine like dinosaurs live with people, you know, like they didn't got eaten by them, you know, because we see those movies where dinosaurs were eating everything. So, you know, like they couldn't imagine how is it possible. Like, oh my God, and Tyrannosaurus Rex is there eating my blueberries, you know, like.
Well, if that's the question, then how are dragons treated in myth and legend? Like they're not nice. You know, it's not a good time, except for that one series of Pixar films or whatever. It's usually not a good time to be hanging out with a dragon. So when people say, well, wouldn't dinosaurs eat people? I would have them refer to literally any story about a dragon from history. But again, the population was not high. Where imagine even that these things existed after the flood, large, angry lizards that were a problem for society. They would be hunted, they would be killed. Where you see it with, you know, people getting rid of wolves in cities or bears. Or in the United States, the buffalo were a problem for the railroads, for example. So we basically made them extinct. I say we, Americans, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's no inconsistency there, I don't think. Where I think the problem people have is they try to partially take both stories, where the idea of dinosaurs were around for millions and millions of years, and then people showed up. So wouldn't the dinosaurs eat them all? But no, that's not what I believe. I believe the people were there first, and most likely, you know, the dinosaurs were probably not as big at the beginning as they became over time. And of course, there is, you know, Behemoth and Leviathan that are mentioned in Job. Maybe those were just seriously individuals, you know, maybe. I don't know. But I don't think, I think that if you really start to think about the idea that, wait a second, a dinosaur is just a dragon, it all sort of makes sense. For me, at least.
And the other thing is that many people have hard times to imagine like there was this Noah's Ark, and all those animals were there, like even dinosaurs, you know, like he had dinosaurs on his big, you know, boat, or, you know, like how do you see like from this view? Because the Bible says like Noah took, you know, from each species, you know,
He
to.
said each kind, and that's the key.
Okay.
Because, you know, look at all the, again, with the dogs, your Chihuahuas and Great Danes. All that Noah had to have were 2 wolves. And, you know, you get all of these animals. He brought 2 wolves with him on the ark, and you get your Chihuahua, you get your Great Dane, you get, you know, your dingo probably. Just all of those can be described by just one. And, you know, you can have quite a lot of variation in quite a short time. Dogs, again, perfect example. So different from each other now, but not jumping across a kind. I guess it could theoretically be possible that the sort of progenitor of each kind that was on the ark maybe were able to produce to some extent fertile hybrids, where, I don't know, this is very hypothetical, and I'm not saying this is what actually happened. But if you look at a fox, at least in my opinion, they look around halfway between a dog and a cat. They're considered canines for the most part, but they have some very feline features. So maybe early on, shortly after the flood, there was a little bit more ability for different kinds to cross or something like that. And then you couple that with the just immense variation that you can get over the last, you know, 4,000 years, and you've got enough. You can have every animal and plant and, you know, bacterium and fungus, everything. It doesn't take that long.
Mm-hmm. And could you imagine like he had some kind of dinosaur there?
Some sort of lizard? Yeah, I'm sure he had some lizards for sure. And you know, have you ever seen a Komodo dragon or one of the river monitors from Southeast Asia around Thailand, Myanmar, that kind of area?
Not sure. Maybe if I would see the picture, maybe, but
They basically look like an iguana, but enormous. So, you know, just for the most part, dragons are just, again, big lizards. And, we have our sort of cultural vision of what a dragon should look like. But that's so different from one place to the next. I don't think the details of that have any significance, except that maybe, the Chinese dragon looks more like a snake, a very large snake, versus the sort of standard European dragon with the wings and everything. Might just been a different species of reptile. Am I necessarily saying that there's a dragon that looks exactly like the one in The Hobbit running around Europe? Absolutely not. No. But I'm saying that at the core of every legend is typically some truth. And that truth is probably a larger than normal lizard. Maybe an angry one. It could be even 2-3 meters tall. I don't know, but not ridiculous.
So they just made it up so big, and
You ever go fishing and then tell people how big your fish were? I mean, if I'm a knight and I went out and killed a dragon that was actually, say, 2 meters tall, definitely telling people it was 5 meters tall. So
I do been hunting dragons or fishes, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. And because I don't know, like people who believe in like the Big Bang and those things, like they don't believe like flat.
What do you mean? Oh, the
like
flood.
they don't believe like flat, like
No, I don't think so. But you mentioned the Big Bang. That right there, you can't go beyond that. Again, I don't like even using the word agnostic for it because, look at Romans 1. I really think that Romans 1 is referring to people who are scientists in the sense of scientism is their religion. Where, in Romans 1, where it talks about denying God's divinity and his obvious perfection that you can see just looking at his creation. Yes. It's obvious. It really is. But you can pass the buck. You can sort of push it away farther and farther. But once you get to the Big Bang, you have nothing creating everything. Which, they mince words. They make it sound super fancy and scientific, but literally nothing created everything. That's what they're saying. Or when it comes to evolution, the abiogenetic problem, where you really cannot, in the 4 or so billion years that they say the Earth existed, that's not enough time for abiogenesis. Even if you worship chance like they do, where you have people who say, I'm going off on random tangents, but that anything is possible with enough time. A common example is if you give a chimpanzee a typewriter and you give him billions and billions of years, eventually he will type Shakespeare's Hamlet. I don't actually believe that. First of all, I think you can give a chimpanzee all the time from infinite amount of time and he will never type Hamlet. I'm sorry. Because essentially, you're multiplying 0 by infinity. The 0% chance that he will type Hamlet times infinity number of years, and you can decide whether you think the answer is yes or no, basically, from that. But in any case, the Big Bang is one example. What is it called? Panspermia is another example, where people suggest that aliens or a comet brought life to Earth. That's just passing the buck. It doesn't do anything. Then where did the aliens come from? On their planet, was it possible for life to form? No, it wasn't, because abiogenesis, the issues with it, which I haven't talked about here today, they can't be overcome anywhere. It's just, and it's difficult for a scientist to say something is completely impossible, never. But the problems with abiogenesis, it takes more faith to believe that happened than it does to believe that God created the world. Seriously, abiogenesis is a nightmare. It's a dumpster fire. It's complete garbage that is on fire.
Wow, that was a really good sentence. So last 2 things. Could you just summarize in 5 short, points about evolution? Goodness. Why do you think evolution is not really that scientific?
Okay.
And then the other thing will be your view, how belief of the Bible, literally what it says, can affect positively your life.
Okay. So What was the first question exactly?
Like 5 main points, like why you think like evolution is not really the scientific proven thing.
Okay. I will make the first point just a general start. Like there's no starting point for evolution. If you can go to the Big Bang, that takes faith. I'm sorry. You have to believe in that. Or you go to panspermia, this idea that some sort of space, either creature or maybe a meteorite or whatever, brought life to Earth. Well, you need faith to believe that, like that it came from somewhere else and existed somewhere else before. Or abiogenesis, the closest one of all those, that just non-living stuff eventually kind of accidentally formed life. You have to have one of those things, actually at least two of them, in order to believe the current sort of consensus paradigm among scientists. And that takes faith. It's not something, because again, when you talk about the extreme hurdles to the likelihood of abiogenesis, you essentially have to believe that that monkey is going to make that Shakespeare play. And I do not have that faith. So that's one. It takes faith. And I choose to put my faith elsewhere. Number two is probably the detrimental nature of mutation in general, where you can have some in-species variation, like Darwin's finches are super famous, where their beaks change size so they could eat certain nuts and seeds on their little islands. That's variation. That's not mutation. That can be beneficial, but most mutations cause either disease, death, or infertility, which is really just death later on in the evolutionary timescale. Next after that, I would say, is probably the DNA to RNA to protein paradigm. It requires DNA, RNA, and proteins to all be there at the same time. And that's just, you can't have that in a gradualist system. Whether that gradualist system is intelligent design or evolution. And when I say intelligent design, I mean sort of guided evolution. I actually don't like that term because I don't believe in guided evolution, this theistic evolution. I don't believe in that.
Like God was doing the evolution.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Like if he can do all that, why didn't he just do what he said? But anyway, that's a big one to me, where, you know, DNA makes RNA, makes protein, but that process itself requires all three. Come on. Next one is just going to be the insane complexity of living organisms, where it seems to me, when it comes to belief in evolution versus creation, there's kind of a up and then down for people, where the more you learn about biology, the more you believe in evolution to a point, and then you learn more and you're like, no, it couldn't be this way. It's way too complicated. Where seriously, biological systems, not counting diseases and things like that, just the general everyday workings of the cells are so perfect that it's unimaginable. Like one of the things we didn't even talk about today was chirality, where organic molecules can have handedness, where you have a left-handed molecule and a right-handed one. They're all made of the same stuff, but they're in a different order, and they're not mirror images because, you know, there's a left-handed and a right-handed one. In biological systems, everything's chiral. And take proteins, for example. It's pretty much exclusively left-handed. Only the left-handed ones work. But the thing about that is you can't produce these molecules unless the environment itself is chiral, where if you try to produce them in a test tube, you'll get 50% right hands and 50% left hands. You can only get the left-handed ones by introducing something that it is itself chiral, meaning right-handed or left-handed. It doesn't really matter. Well, it does for the individual synthesis. But the simple fact of it is biological systems are perfectly refined and chiral. And that chirality, you just can't produce it without the system in place. And just extending on that idea further, like the stuff that we're made out of, the stuff that DNA is made out of, it's made out of a little sugar ring with a phosphate backbone, and then these DNA bases. All of the things I just mentioned, with the possible exception of the phosphate backbone, very, very difficult to make in labs. You can't make them. The way that people get them these days is they get some living thing and they extract these already made pieces from it, where they just, you know, oh, you need some uracil. Well, go grab a bunch of uracil from a living bacterium. And that's the case for pretty much all the major biological molecules, where they are incredibly difficult to synthesize. So we just grow something and then isolate them instead. So I think that was 4. Point 5, I'm not sure.
So many of them, you don't have what to choose.
It's maybe I could just sum it up that for me, the more I've learned about biology, biochemistry, physiology, it just simply takes a bigger leap of faith to believe all of this stuff could have been gradually developed or especially developed by chance. That is far less likely to a rational individual than someone designed it and did it. It's very difficult to believe. Where you'll see many examples of scientists who are like the head of their field, and they actually came around to Christianity through learning in their field. Many examples of it. You know, Tesla, I believe, was a Christian. I don't know if he always was. Einstein believed in God. A lot of the guys, I don't 100% agree with everything they say, but there are some really, really good speakers on this in English that you maybe could refer people to. You know, some of them have been proven to have a few problems, like maybe they said something a little bit arrogantly and it turned out they were wrong about one thing. And that's actually a common thing. A common thing we see is that when somebody takes a stance against science, all it takes is one hole for them to punch, and everybody feels like they can ignore him completely. Like one of the big guys is Kent Hovind. He was really popular in, I think, the late 90s and early 2000s. He went to jail for tax evasion. And I'm not even sure he actually was a tax evader. Maybe they just got mad at him and made something up and putting him in jail. But basically, people are like, oh, no, he's a criminal. Don't listen to anything he said. When his lecture series was phenomenal. And so, you know, there are issues like that. Or one of my favorites is actually Walter Veith. He's from South Africa. He's a pretty strong, I think he's a Seventh-day Adventist. So I'm not 100% on board with his theology, but he is, as far as what I have seen, he is the best of anyone I've ever seen for explaining geology and fossils in the context of the flood, because he really lays it out, and it's clear that the flood makes more sense than mainstream geology in billions of years. It's just absolutely clear. Or with abiogenesis, there's a guy I just found while I was preparing for this interview named James Tour, where people will dismiss him because he identifies as a Messianic Jew. Because like, oh, Messianic Jew, you just ignore him. Even a lot of Christians be like, oh, well, you know, I don't believe in that Old Testament stuff, so I'm not going to listen to this guy. And that's an unfortunate thing with the ad hominem attacks you get. But he does a fantastic job with his, he has one specific video series from around 2 years ago that just dismantles abiogenesis. It tears it apart. The problem is you probably need at least high school, maybe even basic college chemistry to understand what he's talking about. The idea of a Richard Dawkins type thing, that's a modern phenomenon. And honestly, if you don't know much about him, he's a biologist who's just super atheist, very much against the idea, to the point where he insults everyone. He won't even listen to anything you say. But he honestly doesn't have a very good understanding of biochemistry and physiology, based on what I've heard him say. Where, you know, he would probably take me as an example. He'd probably dismiss me with an ad hominem attack that he's a religious nut, when I've just told you that I came to these beliefs through the scientific inconsistencies and the fact that it was easier for me to believe in creationism from like an intellectual integrity standpoint, where I feel like I'm doing less mental gymnastics, where I have to do less twisting of the facts to just believe in creation than to believe in evolution. And that's probably my point number 5, that it takes less faith and less almost lying to yourself to believe in creation than it does to believe in evolution. So I don't.
This is what I wanted to say indeed. Like, from what I was listening to, you know, I just feel like, you know, it takes bigger faith to believe in evolution than to believe that just God created it, you know, like those are the people of strong faith who believe in evolution, because it's so hard to believe it. Like,
It really is, and it's tremendous. Where taking your monkey with making Hamlet example, a biological system is not just one Hamlet. It's like this would be more like you cover the surface of the earth with monkeys, give every one of them a typewriter, and give every one of them as much time as he needs. Not only do you need to get Hamlet, but you need to get every other play. I think there are 36 total from Shakespeare's first folio. Have all 36 produced by these monkeys, have them somehow meet each other and put them in the correct order, even though they don't know how to read. Seriously, it's not just one huge improbability. It's one stacked on another and stacked on another. And if you know even the very basic points of probability and statistics, if you have two events with a certain probability, the likelihood that both will happen is the product. You multiply those events. So if you have one event that's 1 in a million, then having two events like that happen, suddenly it's 1 in a million times a million. And that just keeps going with every one of these events to the point where, honestly, the number is 0. The likelihood that these things happen by chance is so close to 0 that you would need, I don't know, enough zeros to get to the moon and back, and then like 0 point to the moon and back, and then 1%. It's a 0. It's a 0. So it takes just too much faith for me to believe that.
Well, amazing. So now you just can say like how like believing in the Bible, what it says literally, change your life from the view of person who is really scientific based, and you likes to see things, and like not just be like maybe, but you just want to hold it like scientists.
Well, I actually still consider myself a scientist, but I don't believe things just based on consensus. But as far as the influence that it's had on my life, especially unguided evolution, which I never believed in, but especially if you do, it kind of makes everything random and pointless. Life has no meaning, and that's depressing. But even guided evolution, I didn't realize until years after I stopped believing in it. It's a little depressing too. You're like, man, I was a monkey, which is technically not correct because ape and monkey are not the same thing. And people would get upset if they were like, no, monkeys, not monkeys, apes. Okay, sure, primates. Actually, they would say primates because apes are the modern ones. But no, it changes your sort of worldview where you really do feel that importance that, it's really a big deal that the creator of everything that exists created us, you and me, and every person on purpose. And in his image. Like it's a really big deal. But also, specifically from a Christian perspective, Jesus called himself the truth. This is the truth. So if you believe in something else, your relationship with Jesus is damaged by it. Even if you don't see it, it has to be, because it's not true. And it's a central belief to you. Where I got to be honest, when I first realized that evolution was false, I almost mourned it like the loss of a loved one, maybe the loss of a pet, where, it was just, it's not that I missed evolution or I was sad to see it go, but I was like, I have a degree in biology. Half of what I learned is false. Maybe not half, but a considerable, at least 3 courses I took were mostly garbage. So that's kind of depressing, but also, realizing that I have to count myself among those who will be dismissed by a lot of people. Where some of the really best speakers I've seen on this topic, and I can think of 2 or 3 off the top of my head, people often will be like, oh, it's that guy. He's a Christian. Don't listen to him. Because he's, like you said, arguing from his faith. But the science supports, at least to some extent, either one of the 2 paradigms, and from everything I've seen, it supports the faith creation paradigm much better. So yeah, as far as how it influences my life, it makes life have more meaning. It gives me a closer relationship to my creator and to Jesus, who is the truth, where, I'm just so certain of it that it just helps to be sure of things. I feel like it makes me more optimistic, more confident, less afraid of things, maybe not in a conscious way, but it just seems to have an overall general positive influence. because, you know, one of the other things about evolutionary theory, especially when you consider like the geological time scale they give, if you believe in this theistic guided evolution, you believe that God, A, didn't do what he said, which is a big deal, because you're believing he did not do what he said he did. That's not in his character. But you also believe that he kind of waited basically 3 billion years. It's like, you know, we'll get around to those people. You know, but really he waited 6 days, not even 5.5. So that's a big difference. And he was very busy during those 5.5 days. So he wasn't really waiting. He was setting the stage. He was painting the background before he painted the main figure of his creation. But also regarding the spiritual thing, I think it's actually a little dangerous to believe in evolution. Believing in evolution requires you to place so much faith into chance, which is basically chaos, and death, because you're believing in evolution being guided by death. You know, if you don't die, you get to continue. So you're basically putting all your faith in chaos and death, and, you know, nothingness, for example, with the Big Bang, where this is all of your pagan gods, basically. You know, it's not good for you spiritually to put that much faith in these things. Because I mentioned sort of these unseen, I just feel more confident. You know, I feel better now that I believe this stuff. I think that's the effect of having removed that faith in chaos and death that I had before. That was sort of subconscious. You know, I wasn't thinking about it, but some of my foundational worldview was based on that, and that's not spiritually healthy. But this is me just rambling.
Oh,
now.
but this is a really good idea. Wow, I never thought about it. Like, yeah, you really then would believe in chance and in death. Like, if you are not strong enough, you die, you know, and then it forms your mindset of living, you know, like live or die. Wow, I will definitely think about it. Wow, like big revelation right now. Wow, thank you very much, Mike. I'm really encouraged by everything you said, and yes, you know, I know the Bible says that we are not supposed to talk about endless genealogies, you know, like stories, and but I see like this topic is very important because I see like if we believe in God or evolution, like this is like big difference in the way that if God created us on his image or we are just here by, I would say, accident. I see like how much it can have like influence on our identity, as you said, like who am I? I'm just some monkey, or you know, or I'm here created like a human on the image of God, like really amazing thing, you know. Imagine that. Yes, I would definitely chose this one, like be created by God on his image, then just be, you know, part of evolution. And yeah, this is the second like meaning of life, that our life is very purposeful, you know, like meaningful, that it's not just I'm not here by accident. And this is what I really see that people struggle with. So